Yeah. So as I was saying, we're really happy to have this ARI readings event with in connection with the exhibition at ARIEL that Vaughn Belle has at the moment um, for Alberta and Victor, collections of Conjurings and Curiosities, and it's guest curated by Daniela Agostinho. So really quickly, my name is Karen Westergaard, and together with Nina Völk, I run ARIEL Feminisms. And with me today, I have substituting for Nina on her maternity leave. I have Ki Initiative, and then I have Frederikke Granvig, who's helping out with our micro publishing house, ARIEL Press. So if you have any questions, just write us in the chat or write an email. So that's the basics. And then what is ARIEL? ARIEL Feminisms in the aesthetics is a feminist exhibition platform located in Copenhagen in the Women's Building. And we are a platform that does a lot of things, although our size is not grand. We have a very interesting location and context in the Women's Building, which makes us able to have an exhibition program in collaboration with them. And then we have started a micro publishing house, and we have these ARI readings connected to our exhibitions. So that means that every time an artist exhibits at ARIEL, we ask them to kindly let us into their practice and to their research with these open reading circles. So they select literature to go into our ARIEL archive, which is slowly building with our program into this kind of weird chimera archive of feminist thought and artist practice at the moment. So in that's a very, very short way of saying that we have these reading circles to invite people in and to be able to listen and ask questions to the artist and of course also the guest curator. So don't hesitate if you have any questions during the reading. It's really it's not a traditional artist talk, so it is centered around what literature and what archives have helped shape and form and inspire the practice and the work that Vaughn in this case is exhibiting. So without any further ado, I want to give over the word to Vaughn Belle and Daniela Agostinho. And I'm just really, really grateful for all your work. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for this introduction, and thank you for inviting us, myself and Vaughn, to develop this exhibition project with ARIEL. It has been such a great opportunity to continue to think through and deepen our engagement with the residue of coloniality in relation to Danish colonial history and some of its unremembered stories, to use Vaughn's own vocabulary. And I also want to thank everyone who took the time to join tonight for this event. It's really nice to see familiar and new faces and names. I would just like to say a few words about the format of the event before I pass on the word to Vaughn. So as Khan mentioned in the beginning, the structure for these reading events is usually set as a reading circle, where everyone is welcome and encouraged to join with thoughts, impressions, and reflections. But because we are gathering on Zoom and there's no circles on Zoom, but it does allow for more people to join from many places, including people who haven't had the chance to see the exhibition. So we conceived this event to open up a conversation around Vaughn's exhibition and the various questions it raises. And we will offer quotes from the readings as prompts for discussion of Vaughn's work. So Vaughn will begin with a brief introduction to the exhibition, and she will show the video work in the place of shadows. And then we will start off with a dialogue about the exhibition project, taking departure from the quotes that Vaughn selected for this event. And this dialogue that we'll enter to is only meant as a way to unfold some of the questions that Vaughn explores in the exhibition, and everyone is welcome to chime in with reflections and impressions and questions at any point of this dialogue. And we uploaded the texts to a folder, and I'm gonna drop the link in the chat. So we will be mostly drawing on the selected quotes that we will be showing in the slides that I will open in a minute. But everyone is welcome to download these texts and read them whenever they feel like it. So without further ado, I will pass the word to Vaughn, who will be introducing the exhibition project.
Okay. Oh my goodness, thank you so much. You know, Karen, Nina, who's not here, Helen, Daniela, it's been such a pleasure working with you guys. This has been a long time coming. It's, you know, even some delays, of course, during the pandemic. And when I was first invited to think through doing an exhibition in the space, you know, I was very excited about the location of the building. And then, of course, thinking through the history of the building. Daniela and I learned probably fairly quickly on in the process that it had a very unique connection to the former Danish West Indies. In 1905, one of the women who was one of the founders of the Women's Building, named Emma Gadd, in 1905, she also had a large exhibition called the Colonial exhibition, where she basically tried to assemble various people and artifacts from the current colonies as a way to try to engage people around the present, not even the history. As a part of that exhibit, she decided that she wanted to have some actual people come. And in lieu of not being able to get adults from the former Danish West Indies, she requested that maybe children could be brought. Those two children, Alberta Viola Roberts and Victor Cornelius, their history, depending on who you speak to, can be very present or known, and to others it's very unknown. But I think their stories became a lot more visible during the 2017 centennial. And I felt that it was really important, especially when you're thinking about feminisms, to think about these kind of intersecting histories, and how, on the one hand, this building, this woman who's advocating for women's liberation and the kind of the beginning of the women's movement, what happens when the consideration of Alberta, Victor, and their families were not really considered. The children were supposed to, it's unclear if they were supposed to have returned home, but it's clear that from letters and research that at least one of the parents wrote asking about her daughter, what happened to her. And you can see also in some of the archives, just the way that the children were brought was very much, you know, looking for families that were desperate, looking for families that would give up their children. And then, of course, when I was, you know, searching throughout the archives, there were lots of questions to think about in terms of the violence of the images around them, how to work in an exhibition space that is almost like a display case, about a history of two children who were displayed and also displayed in cages at one point in a way to try to contain them from playing and moving around in the exhibition. And so for me, it was, yeah, it was definitely a challenge thinking about a lot of those parameters. How do you think about care and sacredness? How do you deal with these very violent histories with that level of care that they require? And then also thinking about so many of the silences and the gaps in the Danish colonial archives and the frustration of not only dealing with the violence, the silences and the gaps, the distance, the inaccessibility, but also thinking about my relationship and kind of implicating my own story and my own body into these histories. So there are two pieces that are part of the exhibition. It's a collage of, that I've been working on for this series for a while. It's a later version of a longer series, but it's called How to Imagine the Tropicalia as Monumental. And it's a large scale collage. I don't know what it is in meters, but in feet, it's about 10 feet long and about 6 feet in height. And it's basically piecing together fragments of paper, piecing together fragments of also cuts and burns to think through, you know, how do we think through these, the disparate parts of our history, and kind of, it's almost like a cartography, a map making exercise. And then the other piece is a video essay entitled In the Place of Shadows. So I think you just showed the collage for a moment. And then, so the video piece is In the Place of Shadows, which I'll show. It's just about 7 minutes. So I think we have enough time to take a look at that. So I'll show that now. And then, do you have to stop sharing your screen, Daniela, for me to share mine, or? Okay, maybe. Okay, should I do it in full view? I'll pause it briefly just to double check the sound, and then I'll continue. From the moment we break off from our mother's bodies, we are all, the sound's okay? All right. From the moment we break off from our mother's bodies, we are all wandering fragments. Like shadows, we tether ourselves to each other, to land, and even ghosts. The horizon refuses to bend in sorrow. They sent for you. Send 2 Negro children, they said. Keep a low profile, they said. When getting onto the ship, Victor says you cried, Alberta. The ocean scares me too sometimes. The pull of its currents, how it sprays and spits, and how it's always moving, always. Even when it's so still that you can skip stones on its surface. But it's really because all our sorrows fall back into the ocean, even if they start as tears. It holds stories that you will not find in history books, but is history nonetheless. I want to tell you a story. There was a little girl who traveled to the place called the United States of America. In a way, she was already there. It's still St. Croix, but it was no longer Danish in 1980. By then, it was owned by the United States. So perhaps now you understand what I mean. When you leave a colony to go to the mainland, you basically migrate into the same country. You did that too, in a way, leaving the Danish West Indies to go to Denmark. But a place inside a place doesn't mean it's the same thing. Different rules, different gaze. I know you know what I mean. It's the first time white people stared at me like that. And oh, they stared at us. Like you, Alberta, I think I was the first little Black girl they had ever seen. It seemed as if we were the first Black anything they had ever seen in a little town in Wisconsin in 1980. They stared at us, driving along the highways, shopping in the malls, walking in the street. In school, sometimes instead of paying attention to the teacher, they would just stare at me as if I was the lesson. I couldn't wait to get back home after my father finished his year studying to get back to my place inside a place where I didn't feel constantly on display. That feeling stayed with me for a long time. For many years later, anytime I traveled to the States and found myself captured in their gaze again, I would feel like someone was filling a balloon in my throat, leaving no room for my own breath. It's like their gaze left a permanent shadow. I think about what that felt like to live the rest of your lives that way, in a sea of stares and shadows. Dear Victor and Alberta, I have a confession to make. I stopped searching for you. At first, I tried to read everything about your lives, your journey, the newspaper articles that talked about your arrival when you met the Queen and the coins she gave both of you. Victor, I read about how you spat at people in protests when they tried to touch you. I saw all the pictures of you, at least the ones I could find. Your sweetness shined through. I saw the one of you outside of Tivoli playing and you, Alberta, inside a classroom, and both of you sitting in front of someone's summer house. I wondered about why there were no images of you in the exhibition or in the enclosures. Forgive me, the cages. I even read a letter, Alberta, one your mother sent you. Did they read that letter to you like they said they would? Were you ever able to write back? I mean, this message is for you, but I know you didn't read or speak English anymore, and I know your mother didn't speak Danish either. I stopped searching for you because in the traces left in Denmark, there were only shadows. What I didn't know yet is that I could make my own. So I went to your childhood homes, stood outside looking at what you might have seen, the well you likely got water from. I even found a piece of Cheney near your house, Victor. I wondered if you ever played with them like they say children at your age and time did. Alberta, truth be told, I wasn't sure if I was standing in front of your house, I couldn't remember if the person who told me where it was said it was a second or a third going north on Strand Street. But standing there, I knew that even if it wasn't your house, for sure, I was walking in your shadow. It's not just the ocean that holds stories. The land does too, and the horizon and the trees, especially the trees. Sometimes I feel I must burn out all the silence and burn out the absence and unknowing, but I know that doesn't make sense. It's just we burn things sometimes to transform them. Dear Victor and Alberta, I know you don't remember much from your time living on St. Croix. No one really does remember their young childhood before language, when life is mediated through touch and smells and laughter and pictures. Maybe memory is only what we can language and put into words, craft into story. But the body holds memory too, and can language too. I wonder if I can put my body in the places your bodies have been, in the place of your shadows. Maybe I can find your story in me. Maybe it's always been there. Maybe I am both your stories and mine. Stop share. Okay. So thank you so much for your patience and for listening to me introduce the exhibition. I think now, Daniela, is the time that we'll start going through the text.
Trying to organize my desktop in the least disturbing way. Okay. Can you see it? The quote.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So Lavon and I wanted to begin with the quote that Lavon selected to guide this event, which is taken from A Map to the Door of No Return, Notes to Belonging, by Dionne, the Canadian writer born in Trinidad and Tobago. And the book was published in 2001. And we're actually reading her work at a moment of commemoration of 20 years of publication of this book. And the book has been recently celebrated with a fantastic program curated by Christina Sharp, which can be entirely watched on YouTube. And I'm happy to put the link in the chat for everyone to explore it afterwards. But Lavon, maybe you want to read from the quote before I ask a prompt.
Okay. I have not visited the door of no return, but by relying on random shards of history and unwritten memoir of descendants of those who passed through it, including me, I am constructing a map of the region, paying attention to faces, to the unknowable, to unintended acts of returning, to impressions of doorways. Any act of recollection is important, even looks of dismay and discomfort. Any wisp of dream is evidence.
Thank you. Vaughn, I know that this book has been influential for you on many levels, perhaps more than what we can do justice to here today. But perhaps you can start by unfolding some of the ideas in the quote, namely the notion of constructing a map of the region.
Yeah.
By drawing on shards of history and unwritten memoir. And there are two issues in the quote that I think we could talk about. One is the mapping as a practice and the materials that you draw on for that mapping, which are not sort of the dominant materials for history writing. So could you say a few words about how this practice of mapping surfaces in your work and the sort of the materials that you draw on to do that?
Yeah. You know, so I live in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands, which was carved into about 150 sugar plantations. And we live in the remnants of that slavery and colonial period in a very material way, not just through the built architecture and the shards of colonial pottery, but also, of course, ourselves, our bodies, you know, and we are also a community on the Virgin Islands that after Denmark sold us to the United States in 1917, they sent an archivist to collect a lot of the archives, even things that didn't necessarily belong to Denmark, or that was a result of their colonization, like our indigenous artifacts. They were all kind of packaged and sent to Denmark and then some parts of the United States. And so we've been a community, thinking through Jeanette Bastian's work, that have had to kind of create our history and our memory without archives or without access to our archives. So that's made me think a lot about the different kinds of archives that exist, not just the Danish colonial ones, but you know, looking at, for example, even like this, the shards of colonial era pottery, which in the Virgin Islands we have a name for. We call them chainy, which is a hybrid word for China and money. And so I have a series of paintings like the one in the back, where I'm piecing together these fragments to kind of think through identity formation, think through these histories that keep resurfacing, because these shards, they kind of keep coming back in the soil, or along the beaches, you'll find them. And I think it's a beautiful metaphor to think about how the past is, of course, still very present, but just this nature that it kind of keeps coming up. And so, you know, Dionne Brand's work, when I read this quote, I just felt it was so relevant to the way that literally, you know, she's using words like shards of history, and I'm using a lot of these building fragments, fragments of coral stones that were part of foundations of buildings that have been cut out of the ocean by enslaved Africans. It's very much a part of my practice to think through a lot of these fragments and kind of how to piece them together, and using imagination, critical fabulation to think through creating something new. It's almost like a form of self-possession, a form of developing my own vocabulary, my own currencies. And so I feel like very much similar to the chainy work that I've been doing, these new collages that are, one of them is present in this exhibition, is very similar in terms of taking these fragmented histories. It's using the way that I started doing that work was first thinking about the iconic image of a palm tree in a storm. And so they started off as these very simple black and white drawings. And I started those in maybe about 2015. And as I've kind of worked through them, you could see that the palm trees are actually almost like they're just actually not parts of the fragments. They're not the main thing. After we had our major hurricanes in 2017, my studio, which I'm in now, was damaged. And I had actually a lot of my artwork that was damaged and a lot of the paper that I had. And having to throw away a lot of that stuff, I thought I had saved some. And then when I started working again on these drawings, I realized that when I unrolled the roll of paper, they were, they kind of crackled and were kind of falling apart. And I had a friend actually that told me, you know, my impulse was to throw them away. And he said, but Vaughn, your work is about archive. And in a way, the paper holds the archive of the storm. And so that's how I started, you know, using that paper and reusing it and thinking through, you know, not just the violence of natural disasters, but the colonial violence, and also the resistance. You know, there's an aspect in the work, I don't know if you can quite see it here, but that there's sections of another vocabulary in my work called cuts and burns, which I'm burning into, making cuts and burns into paper, thinking about developing a language of resistance and kind of the ways that colonial systems dominated the land through slashing and burning it, but then workers, and the enslaved people would then take those same tools and use them as liberatory tools and transform them, and how all of our major revolts and labor resistance movements like the fire burn that happened in 1878, they were done using fire and cutting. And so all of those are kind of being mapped out in these collages. And then, you know, and thinking through the video work and thinking through the story and narrative of Alberta and Victor, you know, again, we're just dealing with fragments in the colonial archives, you know, a letter here, a newspaper article there, and trying to figure out how do I piece together a story of how do I figure out how to access them, and what that journey and process could look like. So that's kind of how that quote informed my process.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a good time to ask anyone if you'd like to add any comments, or if you have any questions about the two works or some of the notions that Dionne Brand mentions in this quote.
I'm sorry, would you mind maybe putting up the quote again?
Oh, sorry. Can you see it?
Mhm.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Mhm.
Vaughn, maybe you'd like to say something about this, the last part of the quote in which
Any
Dionne
wisp of dream
says
is
that,
evidence. Yeah, I mean, I think that helped me. It helped me to, I've started doing more like video essay type of work, both in, or I should say visual essay type of work, because sometimes I've done pieces like, there's an essay that I wrote called The Monuments That Won't Fall, and I have other, it's been a part of my practice, but it's a part of my practice that goes back actually quite far. Before I decided I wanted to be a visual artist, I actually wanted to be a writer. And so I've tried to find various ways that, text is always, a narrative has always been a part of my practice, but in particular over the last 10 years, I've used it to try to interject into a lot of the spaces that, I guess, interject in a lot of the silences and spaces, and trying to kind of, and so for me, like even documenting this process of searching and thinking through, I thought was really valid. And sometimes it's almost creates kind of another kind of archive, documenting the process of searching. It's another way of thinking through what could be evident, literally. So, yeah.
I was also thinking about what you said in the beginning about how this
Zoom er testet positiv for corona.
I think this someone unmuted
Yeah,
himself
put their
involuntarily.
mute. I don't know who it is.
I was thinking about what you said in the beginning about sort of this uneven distribution of knowledge and history with the removal of the archives from the Virgin Islands to Denmark, where they're still located today. And thinking about how in the absence of those sources of historical knowledge, sort of Virgin Islanders had to resort to other forms of evidence to construct the narratives and identities. And so I was hoping you could say something about what kind of evidence you're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a folk song. It could be like, remnants of coral stones that I find. Because the first time I saw these coral stones outside of my studio, I mean, I knew that I had heard about this historical record of a Danish planter talking about the process of enslaved people carrying them from the ocean. But then there was a whole other experience when, I used them to create this work called Trading Posts, and I had to actually touch them. And there was a different kind of embodied knowledge that came with then having to wonder, like, how did they protect their hands? Because even though they've been in buildings and been in the soil for 200 years, they still were quite sharp. It made me think about how did their relationship to their own spiritual practices impact how they saw that labor and having to be all day out in the ocean. And, I found that really thinking about positioning myself, not just physically, but also like my persona, I guess, inside the history, and thinking through my relationship to these remnants and fragments has helped me to create new narratives around these spaces that I think I've learned are equally important, equally viable, because sometimes there's this worship of the document and the worship of the official archives that are housed in institutions, but that that we have all of these other types of archives and types of evidence to pull from. I mean, it could be also as simple as a ritual maybe a cleaning ritual or a, you know, like even this folk song that we sing about Queen Mary that we learn as children, there's so much embedded in that. It's not just about this legendary hero that we sing songs to, but it's the fact that we are singing to an ancestor and that we are expecting the ancestor to speak back to us. Like those are very African spiritual based conceptions of the world that are still here, that it's kind of like trying to find ways to look at our environments and ourselves, and really kind of rewriting the narratives that we even say about ourselves. So I think a lot of my work has been about that kind of self-possession. You know, whether or not some people feel that post-coloniality exists, I'm definitely not a post-colonial because we're still a colony of the United States. So it's a lot of my work is about trying to that form of kind of self-possession and thinking through what that looks like through my art. Mm-hmm. There's someone with a hand up. I don't know. I think it's Nina.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? It's related. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. I haven't seen the show because I'm not in Denmark, and excuse me if there will be child screaming in the background in a minute, but I'll try to ask quickly before it happens. No, so I was following on from Daniela's question. I'm really curious about the archives of the Virgin Islands being fragmented away from the Virgin Islands, and I'm wondering if there's a movement to try and kind of get these archives back in some way, and what might happen if that happens. I mean, it kind of there's almost a complexity of like how do you care for that archive if you do get it back, and how would
I think
you?
the first question is, so many of us don't even know the archive exists. I mean, a lot of people don't even know that these things exist. So that's the first. There's such a lack, there's such a separation of that knowledge that there isn't even knowledge of what is. And then I think also the way that Denmark has handled the archives, I mean, they've been pretty closed off. It's a part of their history that they haven't really wanted to engage with. So it isn't like there's a lot of education around it either. But of course, during 2017, there was a huge push to digitize a lot of the archives. And so a lot of photographs and court trial records and those kind of archives, documents can be found now online. The challenge with that is many things. One, Virgin Islanders don't speak Danish, and a lot of them are in Gothic Danish. And in addition, it's not like Google searching through the archives. You know, there's certain meta tags of how to even access information that if you don't understand the logic of the archive, you cannot sort through it. So that also makes it like, even though it's accessible, it's still not really very accessible. And then in terms of other things, I mean, I think, you know, our government has been occupied with doing other, you know, we're in a very precarious financial state. And so it isn't a priority necessarily to have a lot of these archives back. I mean, it hasn't been a priority of any of the governments and administrations that I've seen to try to bring any of these things back. But I also think it's, you know, from the few people that I have heard talk about it, of course, there are questions on like, where are we going to house them and the finances to maintain them. But yeah, that's kind of where it is right now.
Thanks.
I could also just add that the article by Temi Odumosu that we shared on the Crying Child on Colonial Archives, Ethics of Digitization and the Cultural Commons also deals with some of the challenges in terms of historical representation that the digitization of these archives now poses, and we'll be discussing that as well, or at least some aspects of it, which is like how to engage with and display or not display and curate this material that has become digitally available, and sort of what are sort of the responsibilities of each one of us in sort of curating and sort of developing ethical ways of engaging with this material that has become so exposed. But the article deals in depth with some of those challenges that we would definitely encourage everyone to read.
I think Erica has raised her hand as well. Hi, Erica.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you. And thank you for this beautiful new piece that you're shared with us. And in this conversation about archives, I was curious about, this very particular engagement you've had with Alberta and Victor, because you so elegantly show the paradox of the Colonial archive, where there is material about them evidently, and then you say you read as much as you can about them and then you turn away. And I thought that was just such an interesting move, and wondered if you could talk a little about that.
Yeah, because the things that were about their lives, I mean, with the exception of Victor has written a book about his own life, but it's not yet translated into English. So I only was able to access it through people writing about it and having sections of it. But, it's people, it's like a newspaper article that has like a sample image of them and complaining about them, or it's a picture of them used to advertise them, where thousands of people would come and see them every day. But it doesn't really give you access to who they were. I mean, you're just kind of looking at these pictures of them taken in such imbalanced situations of power, and not, people who didn't necessarily care about them. And then to think that that is the way that I would find a way to access their lives, it just felt so, it felt futile. It felt, it was saddening and disheartening as well. There were some details in the images that I found by looking at them, like, I have 3 daughters, and to kind of look at Alberta and wonder, like, who's combing her hair? Because why does her hair look like that? And who's taking care of it, and who's, so on the one hand, there was all these things that I couldn't know, but then there were also things that if you look really closely and they were so also violent. And so I decided that would not be the authority by which I would build a narrative on their lives, that I could do something else. Yeah. So I think this is,
There's another question.
yeah.
Dionne?
Yeah, thank you so much for this evening or day for Vaughn, I guess. I wanted to ask, how do you there is such an emphasis, of course, on these material remains, as you're pointing out, like on these fragments, and how important it was for you also to go and see their homes where they grew up, with kind of this physicality. But at the same time, as Brand is pointing out, that this idea of never going to the door of no return, not needing that kind of physicality. And I'm wondering, how do you, and I guess I'm also thinking about the monuments that won't fall when I'm asking this question. And how do you relate to the importance of materiality and the importance of the things that are not material in your work? How do you think about it? What is kind of to lose and to gain, especially in places that when we go back to visit them, of course, they're not the same as they were. And so how what is it that you carry with you when you go to these places that are already different?
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I went to their houses, I thought I was going to have this moment of something, like I would be able to gain something more. And that was also kind of proving to be a little bit frustrating. I mean, I could kind of stand there and you know, imagine like, okay, well, I'm looking at the houses that they looked at. I'm seeing Cheney on the floor, and they probably, maybe they played with that as children, and I'm, you know, but it's like the other things that make them who they were, their family, their sense of community, like some of those things, those immaterial things that I couldn't quite access materially, but I could access it in a way through my own narrative. And that's why I chose to think about my own memory as another material to kind of build upon and connect to theirs, to their story. So I think, yeah, I mean, I hear that your question is kind of maybe, I don't know if it's necessarily thinking through the pros and the cons, but, you know, I think there was nuanced frustrations both in looking at the Danish colonial archives, but even also situating myself here. And I was hoping for something more. But in a way, I realized that kind of situating myself was another way to kind of deal with the frustration of, you know, because again, you know, like I said, you know, we live in all these remnants of this colonial era too. We live in all these archives in a way, sugar mill plantations and great houses, and but it's like, how do we really begin to gain access in a way that's meaningful? How do we create meaning, basically? That's and so I think that at times the materiality has really been important for me. And other times it's the immateriality. So I think it's sometimes both, depending on, you know, it's like you meander through the different times, spaces, dimensions. So I think that, and if you think about the piece, it's very much like that. It's kind of like a meandering through, which is where the conjuring comes from. You know, it almost feels like a magical like space.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. You want to move to the next quote maybe? Or
after Nina's question and then after Erica's question, I took the opportunity to move to Temi's question, because it builds on just the questions that were posed.
Okay.
Because we often have brought up Temi's work in our conversations, and in particular this quote, where Temi reflects about how to create a sacred environment for images, and to how to insist on care where there has historically been none, right? And so in our conversations, we talked about how to create a space of care for Alberta and Victor's memories, to sort of turn away from the violence with which they are represented in the historical sources that you're sort of trying to grapple with. So can you talk about your, you know, decision?
Should we read the quote out loud?
Yeah, I think that would be great. Yeah.
So this is in Temi's voice. So one of my core concerns is that we have yet to delineate a sacred environment for the images that articulate, in part, the experience of slavery and colonization, that we have not yet decided what material is off limits. I say off limits with trepidation because I do not mean to suggest cultural ghettoization, but rather to insist on care where there has historically been none. Perhaps it is pertinent here to retrace the arc of the problem. Erasures of Black subjectivity in colonial documents and in the information kept by collections that house them, index the hierarchies of rights and value embedded in the slavery system. These erasures also reenact what Edward Glissant described as a deterioration of person, marking African experiences as the quote unquote open boat. European use and commodification of the enslaved body for manual labor transferred to the domain of the visual, producing a surplus of images in different materials, ink, paint, paper, silver, wood, porcelain, that became surrogates for unsanctioned intimacies that only continued through the emergence of photography. Yeah. This quote said so much. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I was confronted with how do I want to deal with the histories of these children, but how do I do that? Dealing with the fact that they were exhibited and then kind of re-exhibiting that trauma and violence. So that was pretty off limits early on, that I chose not to show the images of them. And then it was trying to figure out, if I'm not going to show images of them, like, how do I talk about their story? How do I deal with it? How do I investigate it? How do I create a space to contemplate it? So there was a lot of selection, especially early on. There was an idea that there would actually not really be, there would be kind of be like this opacity to the exhibition, that you really kind of had to come in and like have a more intimate dealing with their history. And I think that, you and I talked a little bit about the language that I use, because in some ways images are conjured. When I talk about her crying, maybe when she first gets on the boat, I mean, so it's like they're, grappling with the fact that there are images that are conjured, but it's a little bit different because it's kind of conjured inside of yourself, which I think is a very different thing from looking at this kind of captured image of them in a colonial archive and kind of representing that to talk about their story. So I think there's something interesting about how the way that I've talked about them, it's not only that I have to very intimately think through, there was this one image there's only 2 images I use from the archives, and one of them is, it's a sea of people. It's like thousands of people outside of Tivoli. And these children were one of the main attractions. And just thinking about that was so shocking to me, what that felt for these 2 tiny children, 4 and 6 years old, to have thousands of people view them, try to touch them, laugh at them, poke at them. And they did that, every day for weeks. It was hard. Like, when I kept thinking about what that must have felt like for them, of course, this other memory of my own childhood, and remembering what the intensity of a gaze like that can do to you, and how it can impact you, not just at that moment, but how that stays with you, how it kind of becomes a part of you in a way. And I think, I just thought about the fact that they lived their whole lives like that. Victor lived to be a very advanced in age. I think in his 80s, I think he maybe lived to be. And then unfortunately, we know that Alberta died very young in the orphanage. I think she died around somewhere between around 15. But just that, unlike myself, who I had my family around with me, they were just kind of alone. I grappled with the sentimentality of the work, but at the same time, I think a lot of times when we're thinking about these colonial archives, sometimes we just see them and we actually don't engage with them enough. And I remember doing an exercise with Temi that was so beautiful when she talks about this image of the crying child, where she had a workshop where she asked people to speak to the child. And all of a sudden you thought about this image so differently. She asked, like, what, this child is in this postcard image and he is alone and she's crying. Like, what would you say to her? And all of a sudden it re-shifted that this is a human being that has people that loves it. It just shifts it. And I think that's sometimes a lot of what needs to happen when we're dealing with this history, is to, I myself, who deal with it a lot, sometimes you think about the enslaved people and you just focus on their labor and you kind of forget that I remember I saw something in the colonial archives that just made me shift, and it was a hammock. It was just a handmade hammock. that was in a basement in the National Museum. And so many times when we see images of the enslaved, we see chains, we see workers' tools, we see ledgers of their value and the way that they're being described in this context. And then here was this super intimate object that they made for themselves to sleep on. And it just shifted so much for me in the way that I think about their history. I think sometimes even in, you know, like there's like a dehumanization a re-dehumanization that happens in the way that we even engage with the archives. And so for me, this work was really about like rehumanizing in a way the archives. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess of course is this kind of deterioration of a person that Glissant talks about. Like that's the, and kind of how do we build that back up? Or how do we reinsert it? Yeah, and the strategies to do that.
Vaughn, thinking about this sort of the politics of display that you're trying to think through with this work, maybe for those of you who had not the chance to see the exhibition, or maybe because exhibition space is actually a window display. And so one of our concerns when we're discussing the exhibition project is how to either, you know, interrupt or undo the display of the space, and sort of how to create layers of opacity in a space that is ultimately an infrastructure of display. And I just wanted to you sort of went from using the installation itself to create opacity to sort of develop another form of opacity that it doesn't have to do with obstructing the visibility of the window space, but it's actually a form of opacity that is very much within the form of the artworks. And so how this opacity that is actually woven into the film and into the collage, how you thought about that.
Yeah, I think, yeah, it's interesting to think about the opacity that's kind of woven in. I mean, especially when I think about the collage, I mean, I'm not sure if it's a landscape, it's a map, but I don't necessarily know. It's like, how do you read it, right? It's sometimes like when I've shown it to people, because I've actually it went from my studio and I sent it. So I didn't have a lot of other people look at the work before or in physical space looking at the work. But when I did send it, to some people, just like an image, it's mostly about like the feeling, like it so much captures this, I guess, kind of the complexities, all the open complexities of what it feels like to be a part of the Black Atlantic. It's what I would probably say the work best captures. And some of that is not necessarily something that I can, so I think it's interesting to juxtapose two works, that one is like very verbal and then the other one is just more like this, I don't know, it's a feeling of violence and chaos, but also this incredible resilience. It feels like holding on and constructing anew. And then there's also moments that feel like rest. I mean, I think that the work kind of has all of those things, this particular work. For me, it's also not a work that's created, just like my Cheney paintings, it's not created thinking through a composition. It's very much a process piece. So meaning like I'm not starting off, even with the Cheney work, I am starting with a blank canvas and a frame. These works, I may start on the far left, piecing things together, and it moves out. I mean, it shifts so I describe them, they're very much kind of like process works. Like it's, what it is almost like a documentation of this process of thinking through these histories and piecing things together and finding places that fit. And the Cheney works that I do are very much like that. In terms of like the built-in opacities of the other work, I mean, it's, you know, I like thinking through a lot of Glissant's idea of kind of like the right to opacity, and how there are some things that should not be knowable to everyone, and that's okay. And it's kind of feeling comfortable that I don't have to access all of these children's lives. Like I don't need to, they don't, it's sometimes like this demand of knowing is also kind of quite violent, because we all have our interior worlds that deserve some kind of opacity. And so the work is also, on the one hand, it may seem like, you know, because it is like a very intimate memory that I'm sharing about my own childhood, it is also grappling with the not being able, like there's lots of things that I don't have access to even their story. And it's kind of recognizing also that that's okay. Yeah.
I think that's such a great addition to what we discussed before, drawing on Brand's work. And when she mentions that any wisp of dream is evidence, that this is not necessarily about seeking out all kinds of evidence that is out there in sort of this sort of documenting and sort of need to uncover everything, right? So that this evidence that you sort of draw on is not meant to be exhaustive or fully capture.
And it's also recognizing that that's impossible to, you know, I mean, you know, we haven't read the Trouillot work, but of course, you know, those opacities is a part of the creation of history. There's always going to be certain silences and gaps, and that's embedded in the process. I don't know, maybe if we don't have questions, that might be good to go to that quote. And then of course, if people do have questions or comments or anything, I'm, you know, curious what other people are thinking about this idea of opacity. So I will read this section. Silences are inherent in history because any single event enters history with some of its constituting parts missing. Something is always left out while something else is recorded. There is no perfect closure of any event. However, one chooses to define the boundaries of that event. Thus, whatever becomes fact does so within its inborn absences, specific to its production. In other words, the very mechanisms that make any historical recording possible also ensure that historical facts are not created equal. They reflect differential control of the means of historical production at the very first engraving that transforms an event into fact. Silences of this kind show the limits of strategies that imply a more accurate reconstitution of the past, and therefore the production of a quote unquote better history, simply by an enlargement of the empirical base. To be sure, the continuous enlargement of the physical boundaries of historical production is useful and necessary. The turn toward hitherto neglected sources, diaries, images, bodies, and the emphasis on unused facts, facts of gender, race, and class, facts of the life cycle, facts of resistance, are path-breaking developments. So yeah, I think that for me, you know, it was, you know, I've often conceived of my practice as thinking through the silences. And I think this exhibition and this piece really got me to think through, you know, I'd always thought about it from this lens of like the Danish colonial archives won't have our subjectivity in them. So my position was to kind of infuse African descendants for subjectivity, Black subjectivity in the archives. But I think this work definitely also got me to realize, like, you know, there's always going to be absences and silences. And sometimes the ways that people escape the archives are actually good. I think my work with Visco and also thinking through the prison records of the Queens of the Fire Burn also got me to realize, like, and of course, you know, thinking through my own house and the legacy, this house is the first registered owners from 1777. And sometimes when I would look at an owner, they just show up in a census record. And so you kind of sometimes lament, like, where's their lives? Why isn't it captured? But sometimes you also wonder, maybe that means they lived a life that they didn't have to be constantly confronting the Danish penal system. That might actually be a good thing. You know, like there's ways that people show up in the archives that really are more so about colonial power. And so there are other ways that people live their lives that are just as sweet, just as significant, just as joyful, that will never show up anywhere. And I think that thinking through Trouillot's work definitely, you know, got me thinking a lot more about that. And that was okay, that there were going to be parts of these children's lives that would never be recorded in the Danish colonial system. I could kind of intimate them in some of the things that I was thinking through and talking about, whether it be playing with Cheney or imagining that they were on a beach, or, you know, I struggled a lot because when I was collecting images for this, you know, it's very difficult to go to any beach on St. Croix. I mean, yes, we have lots of beaches that are private, but a lot of times I was filming, there were lots of other people around. There's beautiful images of children playing and jumping off the pier and all of those things that I had to grapple with. Do I show this? And, you know, especially in the context of an exhibition space, in a display case, in the context of this history, I just didn't want to re-show children that were from here as a way to kind of connect to their childhood memories. So that also I had to kind of grapple with and think through. You know, then there were also issues of like permission and their parents' permission and the children's, I mean, there was just, you know, the same things that when the same questions of the production of the archives that we don't often think through. Questions of ethics, questions of permissions, questions of intimacies that maybe people didn't want to be displayed. So I think, you know, there's another author that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but his work has also really informed my practice. His name is Kevin Kwashi. And he has this concept of the sovereign of quiet and thinking through interiority and Blackness and how so much we think about Blackness as what should be displayed and what's on display. And he really gets people to think through that that in a way is another form of dehumanization, because we're not looking at the full human spectrum and thinking about our interior worlds are just as rich, just as vast as our exterior ones, and either ways that they show up or don't show up, how those parts of ourselves are on display and other times that they're not, and thinking through the right to not show that. It makes me think also, like when I lived in Cuba, you know, I went to an art school that had multiple disciplines on one campus. And I remember talking to the people who were in the folkloric department. And people all over the world would come to learn traditional Afro-Cuban drumming. I mean, you know, Cubans are known for their percussive legacies, and people from all over the world would come. And I remember talking to one guy and he said, you know, they think we're going to teach them everything. We do not. We always keep stuff for ourselves. They don't have a right to know, just because you're paying us and you come here, that we're going to teach you everything. Some of it is just for us. And I think those are some of the things too that as I work with the archives more, those are some of the questions that are also surfacing for me.
Are there any questions or comments? I thought it was really striking to hear you talk about the difference between, we could say, the silences that damage and that harm, and the silences that protect. I think that's so beautifully woven into this works.
Yeah.
And because I'm sharing my screen, I can't really share things in the chat, but after I share the last quote, I will stop sharing my screen to share a few other resources, namely this book that Vaughn just mentioned by Kevin Quashie. Should we move to the last quote by Kay Miller? Because I think it would be wonderful too. So the final quote that Vaughn selected is from a chapter in Kay Miller's new book, The Things I Have Withheld, which was published this year. And it's called The Letters to James Baldwin, in which Kay Miller writes letters to James Baldwin. And I think I was just curious to hear about how the sort of epistolary form of the video was inspired by the form of writing to your ancestors, and sort of what kind of gesture is present in that.
Yeah, this book just came out this year, and
maybe you'd like to read it as well.
I will. Thank you. So dear James, I think about why we write letters as an antidote to distance, as a cure for miles and the space that stretched between us. If the beloved were present, there would be no need to write. I think about the distance that is between us, which is only the distance of life and death and nothing more. Because, and this is painful to say, there is little between the world you described, the set of circumstances you wrote of, and the set of circumstances we live in now. And what I want from you is a way to write the things I have been trying so hard to write. So this book is a collection of essays that just came out a few months ago by a Jamaican writer, and that's living, I think, in London or in England. And the first chapter is him writing to James Baldwin, and also kind of introducing his title, which is The Things I Have Withheld, which is actually a quote from Dionne Brand's work. I love I was very inspired by the epistolary novel format, because it was a way to create an intimacy with James Baldwin, a way to cross time and space and distance, and a way to really deeply engage with like a way to try to connect to hit not only James Baldwin's story, but really like connect to his own story. And the entire book is really thinking about Dionne Brand's quote, which said some of the most important things are in the silences. It's the things that we don't say that actually can reveal so much. And so the series of essays for Kai is him thinking through awkward moments with friends, lovers, situations, and the things that he didn't say, and trying to find a way to talk about them. And I guess for me, like that was how I was able to access this childhood memory, and a way to connect to the story of Victor and Alberta. And then, of course, grappling with the fact that although I'm writing to someone who lived over 100 years ago, or about 100 years ago, that some of the circumstances are still the same by which they live. So it's kind of like this collapse of time that can happen in that space, in this particular form of the epistolary essay or writing, that it creates this portal. And so that's really what I wanted to create for this video work, to kind of create a portal of a way to access. And I was very inspired by Kai Miller's work.
Something
And
else.
also, what does that, there's like a truck coming on outside, so I'm just gonna pause. What does that mean to begin to grapple with the things that you have withheld? And like, why have you withheld them? Do you withhold them because they're painful? Do you withhold them because you haven't been able to yet find voice to them? Do you withhold them out of fear? You know, it's kind of like, for me, it was because I grappled with, you know, do I share the story of myself or not? And usually, sometimes when I'm making artwork and I get that feeling, I know that that's kind of a good path. If there's some kind of, if implicating myself makes me feel something, then I know that it's a path that I probably need to explore. So, yeah.
Vaughn, there was another letter that did not mention, which is the letter that Alberta's mother sent to Alberta. And that we don't know if Alberta ever read them.
Yeah.
And so
yeah, when there's an exhibition here at a plantation museum that I went to kind of learn a little bit more about the two children's story, and they had the letter up, and you see the power imbalances in the way that the mother starts off like super deferential to the man that she's writing to, that took her children or her child. You know, it's like, dear kind sir, it's like lots of these extra references, because what she's trying to then ask is, I need more access to my daughter. Like, can you please tell me more? Because that's the next thing she says in a very delicate way. Like, I don't know anything. Like, you're not giving me enough information about her. Can you please, you know, write more or share more information about what's happening to her? And then she gives a little bit more about their life and her sisters and brothers and how they all miss her. And then in the exhibition, they also had the letter that he wrote back to the mother, basically stating that he will, you know, tell Alberta about the letter and find someone that can read her the letter. And that's where you get the first indication that, oh my goodness, Alberta doesn't speak English anymore. You know, that she can't, like, so that there's other super violent separation, that they can't even communicate directly anymore. So even though the mother's writing to her daughter in this letter, it was like such a pain to read the two letters together, to realize that that had been lost. And so for me, you know, I'm also signaling that and trying to kind of repair that in a way through my own gesture to writing to them.
I will ask again if anyone has any questions or thoughts.
I can maybe jump in. I feel like I don't really have a question because I have so many thoughts and reflections from everything that you've been saying that I kind of need to process this. But I think it was really interesting how you described this scene in Tivoli, where you describe kind of a sea of people, and how that connects back to kind of how you talk about the sea and the ocean, in a way, something that is, you know, scary and suffocating. And if that was, yeah, it just kind of brought me back also to that idea, but also how things resurface, and how that also connects back to this idea of the sea, but also resilience and resistance. And something that also kind of was very striking for me is how this connection that you make with your own memories, and I think, and kind of the embodiment of them, is something that I can also kind of connect with personally, having my ancestors kind of like, I don't have anyone above like my grandparents, and then everyone being like Eastern European Jews, like just other than my grandparents, I don't know my family tree like at all. And then to think how we carry in our bodies maybe memories, or there may be some ticks that I have that maybe some great grandmother had, and and kind of that connection, but how in your work you also maybe respond to a thing that Trouillot also writes about, and I don't know if he's writing about it. I don't think he's writing about it in the book that we just did an excerpt from, but this idea of creating pastness, and how sometimes through what we see today of these kinds of official apologies that he was criticizing, for example, if Denmark was to apologize, it would create an idea as if it's something that just belonged to the past and not like ongoing, and how by connecting it to your own memories and kind of ongoing life, you show that it isn't like a separate realm of time. It's like this ongoing. So it's just like reflections that I have and still kind of thinking about it, but yeah, a lot of food for thought.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. I mean, you know, how is it, even, I don't talk about this so much in this work, but the essay that Temi Odumosu is writing, she uses another work that I have, where I use that image of the crying child and I juxtapose it with an image of myself as a child. And in that, that's a part of a larger work where there is an image of me that was taken, which I had considered using, but decided not to, when I lived that year in Wisconsin, feeling like I was on display. And that image was captured of me with the same gaze. It was the same like curiosity gauge, you know, like, oh, look at this little Black girl, because I was the only one. And I think there's you know, being in a place like Denmark, you know, the project I've done with Jeanette, I Am Queen Mary, we had such different points of view to the way that we approach the work, the way that we, like, the way that our practices kind of intersect in that monument. And a lot of it deals with our different positions of toward and like relationships to Blackness, by being her in kind of a predominantly white space and me living in a predominantly Black space, and how those we think about things differently, and but at this, and kind of how Blackness functions in different places, and in some ways across time and space, you know. So that's, the work is also kind of thinking about that. And realizing that I, you know, that Blackness almost as a technology to deal with the violence of the white gaze, like how I was able to connect to their story by realizing that I knew that they had to develop some strategies in the ways that I had to develop those same strategies when I was a little girl. And yeah, and just kind of thinking through what those look like. And some of them, I think, is what Victor does at the later part of his life, where he feels compelled to tell his own story. And I think that that's like a powerful strategy. Yeah.
More comments and thoughts?
I would love to ask a question also, because for us, of course, with ARIEL and with the location in the Women's Building, a work like yours, Vaughn, is so incredibly important in the way that we also talk about, yes, now, how do we deal with coloniality that's not just in the past, and how do we deal with concepts around equality and equity around feminisms. And what I was thinking about when I saw your work in the space was, for one, you have such a way of bridging to people and to engage in a way where I see an older generation can relate to it. So for me, I think, yes, finally I have something where I know that the people that I want to engage and talk about how the structure is within the building and the structures are with the organizations working together about around minorities, about race in Denmark, which is a super difficult thing to engage in, as you all know. But at the other point, I also thought, how is it to know also that you are creating a work that's going to be viewed mainly by white people who should know this, who should feel this, and yeah, and that there must also be some kind of I don't know, not like impatience, but also like sometimes there's also a hurt in the fact that people do really not get this, and you need to push them in order to get it. If you know what, if you understand what I mean.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think for me in this work, I mean, of course, I had to think about that it's going to be, you know, on commercial streets in Copenhagen, and that would be the primary audience in a way for this exhibition. But you know, so much of that work was also for myself. You know, it was I really wanted to find a way to deal with this history, and I think so much of it's like a lot of decolonial practices, I'm not doing it for Europeans, I'm doing decoloniality for myself. So, and perhaps that in the kinds of questions that I'm asking and the ways that I'm engaging the audience will begin to inspire that process as well. Because I mean, the decolonial process isn't just for the people who are colonized, it's also for the people who are colonizing. It's a process that everyone needs to participate in. And I guess that's what I'm hoping that the work also gestures to. But I don't know. I mean, it would be for others to kind of tell me. I think there was a hand maybe that went up.
Susan, did you want to say something? Did Susan raise your hand? Was that a mistake?
Oh, I'm sorry. I probably did. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Now you're on the spot, so you've got to
Negotiating back and forth whether to ask.
You can use the spotlight now.
Yes, thank you. So, no, I was just thinking about this. I'm just, yeah, thank you so much for your work, and thank you for this. It's it's very, yeah, it's very moving on so many levels. But I'm curious about this. I feel like this practice of engaging in dialogue with ancestors through the letter writing, and I'm just you know, I'm almost not sure what the question is. I just want to hear more about, you know, ideas for or maybe your work is really saying it all, like you're using it, I feel, to engage in these very intimate ways, I feel, with ancestral connection. But I'm just, I don't even, it's half a question, okay? So I don't know if you can
Yeah.
respond.
It has a lot to do with I mean, it has a lot to do with my own background as being a daughter of an Anglican priest. My father was a priest, and thinking through part of the colonization process of how religion was brought to the Caribbean as a way to placate people and make them feel that slavery was part of their destiny, and the violence of that, but at the same time, how traditional African spiritual practices were incredible ways that people dealt with the violence of how Christianity was brought here, but also how so many of the ways that still you can see throughout our society, whether it be through carnival traditions, folk song traditions, or just the way that how we see ourselves in the world, that I think, it's very common that people, you may not necessarily believe in ghosts or things like that, but we have this very strong sense that we believe in ancestors, we believe in spirits, we believe that the people who that loved us and cared about us, that they somehow are still with us, they can guide and protect us. And I just have been, I had an exhibition that I was in last year that was called Witch Hunt. And I was invited to think through how that connected to our colonial, our history, and how a lot of African spiritual practices were outlawed. And so what happens is in the Danish colonial archives, you see in court trial records, people being brought to court for following certain practices. And you see them just show up in these very strange ways. And it just, all of that just got me thinking in the work that I did for that piece. It was called Strange Gods Before Thee, about how ritual is another kind of archive, about how, the ways that we revere ancestors that are still a part of our Caribbean traditions or Afro-Caribbean traditions, how embedded in those traditions are these incredible archives and ways of thinking and seeing and being. And so although it's framed as an epistolary novel, it could also be a prayer. I mean, epistolary work. I mean, it's also a prayer in a way. It's also like, it's definitely a form of that as well. It's kind of like a way to talk to them in a way that, many people who practice, whether it be Lukumi or Voodoo or any of these spiritual practices that are still retained in the Caribbean, that's kind of a normal way of being. And as I mentioned before, I think it's very evidenced in this famous folk song that a lot of people approach the song as a way of like, this is a song that talks about our protests and the way that we think about Queen Mary and the Firebond. But when you really think about the refrain of the song, we keep repeating Queen Mary and we ask her, "'Tis where we gonna go?" So for me, we're talking to her. I mean, we're literally in that song asking her for advice. A woman who lived 150 plus years ago, we're asking her for advice, and we still sing that song today, expecting that she will inform, guide us, give us access to the things that we're asking for. So those are some of the, all the different things that I've been thinking about with that work. And I think it's like a new stage of my practice and thinking through archive, and not only focusing on the materiality of the colonial remnants, but thinking about all these other ways that, or the other narratives that are inscribed even in the materials or in the song or the dance, but just, that I guess thinking about like Tina Camp, that the word, like there's another way of listening to images by just kind of thinking through how can we with other senses really think through the archives. And so that's kind of been the direction of my work, how it's been transforming. Because of course, although it's a lot of verbal in the piece, I mean, there's performance parts of the work, and it was really like, and in doing that work, a lot of it, it was very intuitive. I really, it's not like I was like, okay, you're going to do a scene where you're going to go and you're going to move like this. You're going to do like, it was kind of very intuitively like feeling what my body wanted to do and say in this space. And then kind of looking at that, using that as an archive, like what is happening here? What is my body saying? What is it doing? And then kind of piecing it together in the way that I edited the work. Yeah.
Thank you, Susan, for the question.
Thanks. Yeah, I'd love to hear from, anyone else. Or, of course, I didn't get to see the exhibit. I don't know how many people have actually seen it. But I know, Daniela, you said that from the pictures, it has such a different feel. So I don't know, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, because I'm curious, what does it actually feel like to be in the space?
Well, my sense, which is not, I guess it's not the most representative, because I do not have fresh eyes on it, like a visitor would have. But my sense is that the exhibition space is much warmer and kind of inviting a moment of contemplation and intimacy than perhaps the pictures fully capture. I doubt that any picture could fully capture sort of an environment, right? But that's sort of the sense that I have from what the exhibition space does and what the artworks and the dialogue between the artworks in the space sort of invite or solicit from visitors. But I don't know how others have experienced it.
And then also the audio. So for the people who can't be in the space, they can hear the audio outside on the street. So I was kind of curious too about what that feels like.
Susan hasn't noticed maybe that you could, even if you can't go into the space, you can listen to the audio of the video from outside. And so that kind of allows that sort of being part of or watching the video, even if you're not able to sit inside, which is very different, because being able to hear it with the headphones on and sort of in the space is a very different experience. But I think that's interesting that you've decided to give that possibility to also those people who are maybe just passing by.
Can I say something from this position?
Of course.
I don't know how to use, I'm old and so on, but I have seen the exhibition in Kvindernes building, and I think it's very, very fantastic. That's why I'm here, to listen to more. And it's a very, very small room, but it's, as you just said, it's warm and it's well composed on the walls. The collage is very interesting. It reminds me of textile works, and that is, of course, because you have it is used by archive papers, as you told us. You have that has been damaged it, and then composed into this collage. It's very beautiful, and it is the colors are very, very fine. I can't express it very good, but as to the video, it is very clear and outside to be heard, when you pass by on the street. And you can take this, where is it? This one. You can't see, I'll show you at the video, then you can see how old I am, like this. You can see, yeah. You can take it from outside, as many exemplars as you like, and read very clearly in Danish and English. So I think it's very, very, what shall we call it? Well composed and well to be experienced by the visitors. Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lena, for that.
I have no, not a question, but a comment. So I think the text that you chose by Kay Miller is really interesting, and I'm really intrigued to read the whole book.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about how this conversation between him and Baldwin and your conversation in your video is a conversation between two people in space and time, but it's also a kind of a method in the artwork to let someone into that conversation and kind of overhear it. And it might not be directed at the Danes, but in a way it is directed at the Danes, but they're not being addressed, but they're kind of being addressed in kind of a overhearing point. I'm not kind of quite formulating it in the right way, but I'm just thinking about how it's kind of an interesting method of not accusing the Dane directly in the artwork, but in a way letting them into a conversation that they maybe don't have access to, and in that way feeling that they are being addressed, are being implicated in the same way that Kay Miller is doing with Baldwin, how he's kind of talking about these everyday experiences that is going on in his life that many people do not find out about or don't understand. They don't understand that they did something wrong. They don't understand that they said a comment that weren't appropriate. But by having that conversation with another person or letting them in, they're kind of understanding. So I think that's I don't know if you think about that as an artistic method, but I think it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, no, I think that's such a beautiful observation, because that is exactly what is happening. It is, I really did feel like I was talking to them because I was trying to gain access to them, but because it is obvious, it's not just a private conversation because I'm making an artwork, it's a public conversation. So it is an interesting strategy. So yeah, thank you for articulating that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it also plays with this idea of inside and outside, because of course, if you're walking by, I don't know how far away you can hear the sound, but you're hearing this voice talking to someone, and then you might be kind of engaged to listen in. It is like an overhearing. Yeah. And then to kind of also realize that there are these conversations that are happening all the time, whether you're necessarily aware of them or not. Like there's these other levels of intimacies and conversations that people are having. And so, yeah, in a way, I'm letting you in. Because in Miller's work, he's definitely, yeah, he is very much letting you in to, the deep intimacies of the things that he maybe doesn't feel to share, but each essay, you're kind of confronted with a different situation, a different awkwardness, a different, sometimes, there's this one essay where he's being housed by someone who makes this comment about like, what does it feel like to be a writer, like to be such a talented writer from such a place as Jamaica? And there's this moment of awkwardness, like, what does that mean? And how do, this is someone who I'm staying in their home, and how do I begin to grapple with that? And he chooses often in the situations to be silent. And so this is another way for him to address those moments where he didn't have the language, and now he does. In a way, it's like his form of internal redress of what happens sometimes when you feel like you violated your own code. Or something was violated upon you, but then you feel like you should have said something, I should have done something. And so for me, a lot of that work is him taking space for himself to kind of, I can imagine it was a very healing project as well. Yeah. There's some stuff in the chat. I don't know if those are questions or comments.
It's just me sharing resources about your work.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know, Daniela, is there anything else? I mean, we've been talking about this work for so long now. And
Yeah, exactly. That's happy to hear other people comment on the work for a change. Yeah. No, I think those were lovely comments. The question of hearing and overhearing, instead of also this sort of address, like who the multiple ways in which people are being addressed in this work by being let in, and how that's also a sort of a form of opacity that you wove into the work as well, right? Creating avenues sort of for people to be led into the work, but not fully. So.
And then also, you know, I find it really interesting to have then the backdrop of this collage piece that I have. You know, those works started off in 2015 about this big, and so they've gotten bigger and bigger as I've really started thinking about them more as like a topographic, mark making, landscape. You know, I had originally actually thought about doing wallpaper in the space. And I had wanted to do wallpaper around my Cheney work, thinking that that would be an interesting backdrop for that. But then what I realized about my Cheney work is what's special about it, it isn't about a repetition of these patterns. And usually when you're making wallpaper, it is like these very intense repetitions. What's beautiful about that work is kind of like the expansive nature of how the patterns are pieced together. So I thought the best way to kind of carry that energy was to then send this work that I had been working on for a while, and they've been increasingly getting bigger. And yeah, I mean, you know, it's like sometimes you make things and you're still processing them yourself. And for me, I've had someone say to me that they felt, he said, if you wanted to get like a capture of your subconscious, like that work would be it. And I didn't know if he meant like my work, my interior world seems very chaotic, or, but I think that there's something definitely about, I mean, both works that are very autobiographical in some ways. But I think for me, thinking through, you know, as Derek Walcott comments, you know, the sea is history, and thinking about how the land and the sea and the horizons, and how so much of what it feels like to live on a small island is about being confronted with our own borders and expansiveness. Somebody commented a little bit about the ocean. I feel like the ocean can have a suffocating quality, but it also has this incredibly expansive quality about it too. Like it's very multi-layered, all the different meanings of what the ocean can be. And I mean, of course, as someone who's grown up in the Caribbean, I don't know if people realize that, like that, yeah, there is a lot of fear around the ocean. Not just because of the ocean's power, but I think also because of the ocean's history. Just like the way that it holds history in a way that that there's sometimes this fear, especially towards its expanse. Like it's very different to kind of play on the shoreline than it is to swim out and be engulfed and like really feel your smallness in the vastness of that. Or even to go under, if anybody's ever been scuba diving before, that's a very, very different way of engaging with the ocean and like the vastness of it and the complexity of life and history and story that it can hold. I think for a lot of people that think about the Caribbean, especially, we think about just a very surface level of this like tropical landscape with languid palm trees, and we don't see all the other like complexities of what these landscapes are, and or even what that means to have like the palm tree image. You know, all of that is a construction. You know, there aren't a lot of native palms here. almost so much of what we think about as Caribbean or tropical are all constructs. And so the work it's acknowledging that by kind of ripping apart, because I usually make drawings and then tear them apart and then I'm reconstructing them. I mean, it's kind of referring to that deconstruction and reconstruction process as well. Yeah. I'm just thinking out loud at this point.
Well, thank you, Vaughn, for letting us be an audience to your live thoughts. If there are no further questions, I think maybe we should start wrapping up by thanking everyone.
Yeah, thanking everyone for being here. Yeah, this Wednesday night. And saying, of course, this is only relevant for the people in Denmark. But all the titles that Vaughn and Daniela have chosen for the archive is entering the archive, which means that you can come and access it and borrow it home, and yeah, just trying to make the resources available. So yeah, don't hesitate to contact us if you would like to read. They're coming in a week or two, but they're coming. And yeah, thanks so much for your time and your words, Daniela and Vaughn. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Okay.
And
Bye.
yeah,
Thank you.
everybody have a good night. Ah.